Yes, welcome everyone to the second Global 19th Century Roundtable of the year. And my name is Heidi Brevik-Zender, and I'm so pleased to convene this group. I'd like to just say from the beginning that I am speaking to you from Orange County, where I live, which is Tongva and a Hashemem land. So I'd like to make that acknowledgement. I'd like to start out too by saying thank you to the Center for Ideas in Society for funding and supporting our programming this year, which includes roundtables, guest speakers coming in. I think it's mostly going to be on Zoom this year because we're still transitioning out of pandemic conditions, but also the Global 19th Century Graduate Student Fellows. And we have a couple of them here to speak with us today. So we're really excited about that program too, and the opportunity to support graduate student research and to learn more about what people are doing on the long 19th century. So today we have 4 speakers: Jody Benjamin from history, Khellaf, who's in classics and comparative literature, Matthew King from religious studies, and myself. I have a little something to talk about as well. And then our 2 Global 19th Century Graduate Fellows are Mary Casey in history and Robyn Johnson in English. And because this is a very relaxed format, we've asked people to speak for just 5 to 10 minutes, 10 minutes maximum, and just to share whatever it is that they have been working on that relates in some way to the long 19th century. All of this is broadly conceived, and the idea here is just to learn more about one another, since we're often separated into our different departments and worlds and things. So if anyone would like to go first of the speakers, please raise your hand, or you can start, and you can also share a document or an image or whatever if you'd like to. And if no one wants to start, we can just go alphabetically. So that, I think, would be Jody Benjamin, if you don't mind. Would you like to go first?
I had a feeling it was going to come down to that in any case, but I was deferring in case that might not happen, but that's okay. No problem. Happy to start. Hi, everybody. My name is Jody Benjamin, assistant professor of history. Thanks for the invitation. Happy to participate. My first time with this group, and looking forward to hearing about everybody's work and sharing kind of perspectives in our conversation later, hopefully after we've all gone through this. So I just to make it easier and clearer for me, I just kind of prepared a little statement about my work and kind of what I've been up to. So I'll just do that and tell you about my book, which is titled The Texture of Change, Dress, Pluralism, and History in Western Africa, 1700 to 1850. So very much engaging with the 19th century and the turn into the 19th century. And my book mines textiles and dress practices as an expressive archive of historical self-fashioning and social change in Western Africa during a period defined largely by slave trading, Islamic jihad, and an encroaching European colonialism. So my work focuses on a large region of Senegambia and what was once called Upper Guinea, from the Sahel in the north to towns along the tropical Atlantic coast in the south. Cloth economies impacted nearly everyone across this space: rural farmers, artisans, soldiers, merchants, clerics, herders, both the enslaved and the ennobled, in ways that animated processes of colonial extraction, as well as the broader rise of global capitalism, and in ways that get articulated through multiple forms of African mobility and diaspora. So I'm engaged in all of that and thinking about this as a very heterogeneous space whose towns and markets are multilingual spaces And so I'm very much interested in the sort of daily interactions in those spaces, which has occurred between people of distinct linguistic, ethnic, and religious affiliations, displayed complex expressions of an African pluralism. And so analyzing local textile industry and dress practices have allowed me to think about the historical experience of that pluralism from a number of vantage points, and to understand how these local histories intersected with the major global shifts of the period. I was initially drawn to this work through an interest in seeking precisely to understand, or to better understand and explain the internal dynamics of this region of West Africa during a period in which historians, it seemed to me, focus mainly on external factors. And I have found this to be one way for me to situate my study and my research of this period, which has, again, so often associated with European expansion and Atlantic slave trading, to situate it instead into the longer historical context of the region itself through its histories of cloth making, trading, and dressing. So this book is nearly done, and I'm excited about that, and to have it come into the world, and sort of all that hopefully will unfold from there. But it has, the research on it has led me in some new directions with projects that I'm also trying to develop. And so branching off from my work on that book, and also conversations I've been having at conferences in the past year or so, I've continued thinking more deeply about knowledge production as a process, and specifically questions around who is a producer of knowledge, who holds knowledge, and in what ways do knowledge holders transfer their knowledge to others. These questions have opened up for me ways of thinking about the indigenous histories of labor and science in West Africa, for example, and how these have been alternately engaged, appropriated, or erased historiographically and in public memory. So I'm thinking of this as a potential way to get underneath or outside the conceptual divides, the temporal divides and conceptual divides of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, by being able to engage those categories, but from the perspective that centers local knowledge and local knowledge producers. So specifically in terms of like the 19th century, I have been doing some research and doing some work on French colonial indigo and cotton plantations in the early 19th century in Senegal. And this is a period that bridges the sort of end of the legal end of French slave trading and the beginnings of a kind of French colonial state in the region. And so that work has been interesting to think about in terms of the questions that I outlined a second ago. And so, yeah, so there's, the book is nearly done, and I'm sort of working on multiple projects at the same time. And I'll just leave by talking about some of the directions this has gone. I had the pleasure of co-leading a week-long graduate school in the Netherlands last fall that was focused on specifically on textiles and dyes as transnational forms of knowledge. And so it was an opportunity to kind of work with a group of graduate students from basically around the world who'd all come to Leiden for this week. And we did all things textiles with the understanding that this is a city and a country that is historically important in the global textile trade, and in particular with trade to Africa. And so this is some of the ways I've been kind of engaging the questions that I raised. And then finally, I am also one of the PIs for a Mellon Sawyer seminar we have running at UCR this year called Unarchiving Blackness. And it's a group of 5 faculty here, interdisciplinary, and we've been talking about and working together and engaging with invited speakers around questions of archives as institutions and the ways that institutional spaces have archived African and African diasporic life in ways that are this kind of catalog of commodification, violence, dehumanization. And so what does that mean for us as scholars working with these populations and as humanists using the archive? So those are some of the directions, and hope I haven't talked too long, and thanks for your attention.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was super exciting and enriching. And I'm going to ask people and apologize and ask people to hold questions for later. And I'm sure we're going to circle back. I have many questions already. Thank you so much, Jody. So if anyone would like to jump in, any of the other speakers, you are welcome to. Otherwise, we'll proceed through. Okay, Mary Casey. Well, actually, I think you are next.
I guess I was trying to make the best of it. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Casey. I'm, as Heidi was saying, I'm from the history department. I'm a graduate student there, and my overall field is early American history, with a particular interest in borderlands and Native American history. I did my master's degree a few years ago at Northridge on diplomatic gift giving among the Creek leaders and United States leaders in the early national period. From that, I developed a real interest in nonverbal communication, intercultural nonverbal communication. So I took that a little bit further in my studies here at Riverside, and I've been trying to think through and build on gift giving as a tool, as a method, as a mode of power and sustaining power for Native people. And where I've gone with that, okay. And I hope you have all had a good lunch, because this is on feasting, which always makes me hungry. So what I'm looking at now, let me know if you can't see that, is feasting as a category of analysis. And I'm looking particularly at Chumash peoples mostly along the Santa Barbara Channel area, but the Chumash area is larger than that. And at the time of European contact, certainly it was from what's now Malibu up to San Luis Obispo and inland to the Central Valley. So I should pause for a minute and say I'm joining you from Silver Lake, which is Tongva land, and so much gratitude we have for the careful tenders of Tongva land. Thank you to them. So although I study the Chumash, I'm here, and I don't know if you can tell, just to say that I'm pet sitting. So I don't normally, I don't normally have this background. I keep turning around to see, what's going on behind me. So at any rate, I study now feasting as a category of analysis. And this image I wanted to use because I think it really does a lot to convey some of the issues that I'm looking at. And I begin to study feasting. 1769 is the date of the arrival of the Portola expedition. And that's about 73, 74 men who, with priests and soldiers and others, arrive along the Santa Barbara Channel. They're going north to Monterey at that time. It's the first sustained European contact that the Native people there will have. And so there's a lot of ethnographic evidence about the feasts that were seen there. And this is why I got interested in feasting per se. I was very interested in gift giving, nonverbal communication, but there's all these wonderful accounts, these very bemused padres, these Franciscan missionaries, and they're always saying, there's so much food here. They give us so much food. They're competing with each other, these villages, and they're giving us all this food. So I'll get to that more in a minute, but just to say about this picture that it has a sense, I think it conveys a sense of abundance. You see all the acorns in the basket. The basket itself has a lot of meanings, and you can imagine all the care and the preparation that went into making it, the beautiful design and all the meaning that that likely has for the person who's holding it there. The hands themselves, I think, are kind of indicative of all the care and work that would go into preparing feasts. So I think you have a sense in this image of a certain kind of power of feasting. And one thing about it to keep in mind is it's by its very nature a communal event. What I'm looking at is feasting as a category of analysis during this period and how it can lead to the making and unmaking and remaking of communities. So it's about feasting and how they interact with the very communal notion of community. So as I was saying, here on the left, you'll see this quote from Juan Crespi, who's has a travel diary. He's one of the missionaries, the Franciscan missionaries with the Portola expedition. Not sure how well you can read that, but he's saying, he talks about how each successive Chumash village gives more and more food. And he says, an amount of fish vastly greater than any of the preceding ones, so that no one cared for fish anymore and it got thrown away. And this is not an anomalous account. His account continues like this. And that's kind of what led me to think, what is going on here? Are they throwing food away? What is with the feasting is really what my question was. On the right, you can see at the time of the Portola expedition's arrival, there was more than 150 individual Chumash villages there along that area from present-day Malibu up to San Luis Obispo. A lot of them are concentrated around the Santa Barbara Channel. One of the reasons being that that's a really diverse, biodiverse area. There are the Channel Islands there, which are very rich in different kinds of food. And the way that the land, the geography of the land, the way it slopes out toward the west there, it allows for a richer variety of species than other areas. So it's kind of a combination of the weather and the geography makes this a very interesting area and a very biodiverse area. Okay, so feasting as a category of analysis. One of the biggest questions is, how do you define a feast? What does feasting look like? These are things I'm going to be working with forever, so it's not like I have an answer. In the last couple of decades, there have begun to be scholars who focus on feasting as a category of analysis and on theories of feasting. So here's a definition from one of the, about 20 years ago, a book came out that was really, had a lot of really vibrant, interesting theories about feasting. So from that book, the most basic way to define feast is forms of ritual activity that involve the communal consumption of food and drink. Again, that notion of communal. So it's about formation or unformation or reformation of a community. And the theorists of feasting have developed categories that I'm learning a lot about. For example, there's a lot of different things that feasts can do. One whole category is potlatch, which is not part of what I'm dealing with, but you may know that from the Pacific Northwest. And that has a whole vibrant tradition, a whole vibrant epistemology to it. And that's a very specific way of feasting and what the feasting means. It has some of those elements of competitive feasting in it, but more often you see feasting categories as being about social bonding, about enhancing solidarity, creating alliance, promoting or advertising group success. Sometimes they're like you'd hold a big feast so that you'd get everybody to work, so you'd have a work feast. And sometimes they were for status distinction. So overall, what I'm trying to do as I work toward my dissertation is to look at feasting as a category of analysis I'm looking at several different specific feasts that I have either through ethno-historical records or through archaeological remains. And I'm looking at what that shows us about how Chumash people used feasting strategically as a way to move through a very complex world. With missionization in that area of California, it meant there's imposition of colonialism. So that's always the context that's going on. But that said, there's a lot of recent scholarship that has to do with looking at not only Native people within the missions, but also what's going on outside, sort of in between, with the suggestion that, colonialism is not defined by spatiality. So just to look at colonialism within the mission compound really isn't all that's going on, nor is the response from Native people. Let's see where I can go to start to wrap up here. So I'm interested in the role that feasting plays in community formation. These three images have to do with some of the ways that people form community. There's a notion, and I think it's through Bourdieu, about communities forming through practice. That's one of the things I'll be looking at. Any of you who have thoughts on that or anything, I will most appreciate them. But a lot has been, or some things have been written about how, for example, Native potters within the mission formed a kind of community through the practice of pottery making. And I hope to follow that through in looking at feasting and how the act of feasting itself, preparing the feasts, kind of formed a community too. So you have the notion of the acorns on the left are kind of part of that formation of a community. In the middle, those are abalone fish hooks. And again, those were items that needed to be made in order to kill and get ready to prepare the special fish that would be used. For example, the Chumash were able, because of their swift-moving canoes and their fancy fish hooks, they could get barracuda, sea lion, and especially swordfish, which was a very important fish spiritually for them. So it's kind of exciting to think of all that they were able to do in ways that we wouldn't really imagine. And that final image on the right, not sure how well you can see it, but that's one of the tamuls, one of the swift-moving wooden plank canoes that they used to get in between the islands and the mainland, as well as go other places. So I think all of these have a sense of not only do they convey a notion of preparations for feasting, but also the communal nature of what's going on, that feasting is something that you do as a communal activity. And what does that mean? What does that mean for history? What does it mean for the Chumash people? But what does it mean in a larger way? So those are some of the things that I'll be exploring. And I'll end on this image. There's one archaeologist who did this fascinating dig at one of the islands. And she did a dig at a site that people had not known was there yet. They thought that by then that there were no longer Chumash people on that particular island. But she looked at this and she managed to find it. She found all these interesting, huge amounts of fish and food and different kinds of things. And she characterized it as a feast that was broadcasting the social benefits of being part of the group. And what she called it was a feast to show the benefits of being Chumash. So I guess I end with that thought about the power of feasting, that in many ways it's about community, alliance, and in this case, it's about the benefits of being Chumash.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was so interesting. Thank you, Mary. So we'll just move on to our next person and circle back during the Q&A. Would anyone like to go next? Robyn, I see your hand. Sure.
All right. All right, well, thank you all for being here, and hopefully I can follow well the previous two presentings. I'm actually at UCR right now, so I am presenting from Kauai, Tongva. I always say this wrong, I apologize. Luis Sanyo and the Serrano people's lands. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The project I'm presenting on is my dissertation, which is titled Narrating the Wilderness, the American Wilderness as a Narratological Space. So to start this talk, I really want to just allow everyone to see what the legal definition of wilderness is that came in the Wilderness Act of 1964, which is a wilderness in contrast to those areas where man and his work dominate the landscape. Hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. When I began my research, this particular definition was, or it still is, very powerful to me, just in the fact that it's completely paradoxical and not actually plausible. My project specifically is looking at how the American wilderness is created through settler colonialism to further the imperial fantasy, the idea that there's always somewhere else out there to expand that is, you know, quote unquote, untouched. Initially, we can see, especially after, you know, Mary's presentation, that this kind of definition is very problematic because it completely ignores the presence and previous existence of indigenous people in areas that are deemed as wilderness. So the way that my project began was I was interested in looking at the wilderness, especially in the late 18th, early 19th century, and how it was being developed alongside with the idea of American identity. The wilderness is not a new topic. There's been a long history of discussion of wilderness, both in Europe and in America. I break those down into 4 thematic categories, which is like the wilderness condition, better known as like the demonic wilderness, where the wilderness is this dangerous place with, like, monsters and vicious animals, and like the wilderness itself is predatory. Then there's the sublime wilderness, which we see a lot in the 19th century through Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, even as early as the 1830s. And then, of course, the innocent wilderness, where the wilderness, and that's something that continues to pervade today, especially, is that the wilderness is this primitive place that is full of innocence and childlike qualities that needs to be protected from the corruption of man. And then the final one that permeates all of these, whether it's the demonic, sublime, or innocent wilderness, is that the wilderness is a separate world. It is a separate space that stands in direct contrast to human spaces. And that's something that I believe is extremely important to recognize in all these categories, is the separateness of the wilderness. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with these different categories is because that's really the premise of my paper, is recognizing all these different types or interpretations of the wilderness that exist, and recognizing that there are actually all different facets of the same settler colonial process, which is basically creating a narration. The whole way in which American identity was solidified and created was through continual narrations that an American identity, a Western white colonial identity existed. And it's the same thing, and part of the process is the narrating of the wilderness, of making it an actual thing. So by recognizing all those different approaches, even though they're different thematically and sometimes different, time periods, the fact that they're all actual techniques and approaches to creating this American wilderness is what my dissertation focuses on. The first half of my dissertation really looks at the narrative techniques that are used to create these different variations of the wilderness that are simultaneously serving the same purpose. So the three narrative techniques that I look at are native quaking zones, which is a theory most frequently talked by Rod Giblett. Native quaking zones are culture-nature hybrids where the earth and all the elements are in abundance and mixing together. The reason why they're called quaking zones is because of the fact that the earth itself trembles, and so do people when they're standing within the native quaking zones. They're places of a combination of desire and fear. For Giblett, he focuses on wetlands, swamps, bogs, things like that. My project expands it towards wilderness in general, which is not one geological or environmental space, but wherever the settler colonials deem as the new wilderness, whether it's the forests of the Northeast in the early 1800s, or even going out to Yosemite in the later 19th century. The other narrative technique we see is hyperseparation, which is the emphatic separation of the wilderness from the settler colonial spaces, which is done through creating distance in many different forms: mental separation, mental distance, which is just the overall cultural belief that the wilderness is separate. The physical separation between the continual insistence on the physical separation. Whenever you look at fictional texts, and I'm working with fiction, nonfiction, and even maps from the 19th century, they always detail the distance: 300 miles, 400 miles, 10 miles, but it's rough 10 miles. They're always creating a physical distance. And then even as far as temporal separation, when we look in a lot of the fictional works and even sometimes the nonfiction, there's this separate time space that's occurring in the wilderness that is separate, that either moves faster or slower than the time in the settler colonial world. The final narrative technique I explore in my dissertation is the mapping or touring of the wilderness. This is particularly strong in the nonfiction texts, such as, most famously Thoreau and Emerson, where they give us a tour, a verbal tour of the wilderness, a way of mapping the wilderness, making it knowable without actually having to go there. So all these techniques are combining to create this wilderness narrative so that even people who have never been in the quote unquote wilderness can have an idea of what it is. They know what it is. And it's something that pervades to today, where when we hear the words wilderness, we have clear images and expectations because it is a narration that is culturally ingrained into us, which is the wilderness's narration. It is the mental simulations and the cultural images that have become part of our American culture that we can, just picture it just from the suggestion of the word. Or when we watch a movie and there's a wilderness in it, somebody going out to find themselves in the wilderness, it's a set type of wilderness and a set type of experiences. It's also reinforced by, there's this really interesting national park campaign called Find Your Wilderness or Find Your Park. And you go in it, and before you click on anything, it gives you this really aesthetically beautiful short slideshow film of all these different parks. And it very much leans into the let's go find that other world, let's go find this wilderness and find yourself again in it. Then what I am doing by examining this different narrative techniques is hopefully moving beyond the idea of the wilderness. Wilderness is a topic that comes up in literature, it comes up in environmental studies, it's a very diverse interdisciplinary topic, but that does cause problems because when we're talking about, protecting natural areas, the wilderness term helps. So even though it is a very loaded term for helping protect, environmental spaces, we have to recognize that the term wilderness is also coming with its own narrative that isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a good narrative, especially in the fact that it erases indigenous existence from those areas. So my dissertation is wrapping up with this idea of moving on beyond the wilderness's narrative and start thinking about nature's narrations. Traditionally in narratology, narratives need human agency. And I'm finishing my dissertation by arguing that we need to move past this idea of human agency and start identifying the stories that we may not be able to necessarily know, but we can identify that they exist through non-human agencies that are existing in natural areas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robyn. That was very thought-provoking. Thank you so, so much. Let's see. We have Kyle, Matt, and myself. I'll go last. So Kyle or Matt, would you like to jump in?
I'm happy to go, or I can wait too. I'm not sure. Whatever Kyle.
Matt, you're on.
Okay. All right. Let me share my screen here. Well, thanks, Heidi, for the chance to share and to join this group, and thanks to the other presenters. It's already been very interesting. Yeah, I'm in religious studies, but I'm sort of trained in historical anthropology and area studies, and think a lot about the social history of knowledge of Inner Asia, so kind of Mongolia, Tibet, North China, Siberia, in the 19th and early 20th century, in the late Qing, leading up to all the big revolutionary movements of the early decades of the 20th century. In the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, the Mongolian People's Republic, and so on. I'm really attentive to to Inner Asian monks, Buddhist authors who were in these vast scholastic networks, writing about the world, about their time, about history, engaging science, the humanities, the socialist proposition, modernity, nationalism, and all the rest, as a sort of underutilized archive that I think has a lot to say actually for how we practice the humanities today. And previous books of mine have looked at non-Western, kind of heavy quotations, but non-Western histories of the humanities in Inner Asia, outside of influence and impact, outside of a colonial relationship, in fact, with Europe or the North Atlantic, and also of the hard sciences. And so this year I'm on sabbatical, and very lucky to have a position at Columbia in New York, where I'm starting a new book. Well, it's already started, but I'm really focusing on a new book, thinking about the Gobi Desert, and trying to do something interesting, I hope, thinking about and also beyond the environmental, social, and intellectual history of the Gobi Desert, very much on the model of those great aquatic histories, oceanic histories of the Indian Ocean, say of the Black Atlantic, of the Mediterranean, which have really confronted and troubled a lot of our civilizational models. Of course, between, say, Christendom and the Islamic world, certainly between, the West and non-West, and all these other kind of categories. The Gobi Desert, which is illustrated in this slide, is similarly a place of mobility and connection, of erasure, of displacement, and of prohibition, actually, as well, in ways that has connected Eurasia for many millennia. And so I'm really focused on the 19th century in this project. And I want to sort of think about ways that I want to draw from material history of science, that has really tried to center the ways that, like, instruments, the social sites of laboratories, microscopes, libraries, are not just expressions of, but are constraints on kinds of knowledge and knowledge communities over time. Also theorists of space who have looked at, institutions, cities, and all this. And I want to think about how the materiality of the Gobi itself, as an unbuilt space, was its own kind of material affordance or material constraint on ways of reimagining the human in the long 19th century. And so here I am thinking trying to think about how to think about the explosion of imperialist scientific expeditions into the Gobi Desert, as well as local and well-developed, long-standing literary and intellectual traditions among Gobi-dwelling peoples, And not just from imperializing kind of expeditions from, say, the American Natural History Museum is a major archival site for me in this project. There's a lot of Russian interest as well, but also Japan, and also the Qing Empire, which in the 19th century, only in the 19th century, really for the first time in all of China's history, began trying to comprehensively map and know the Gobi, just as the British were coming up from India, as I said, the Russians, the Americans, the Japanese, the Swedish, and many others. And in one sort of large register of those working in a scientific paradigm, which could also include Mongolian people as we get into the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and also Tibetan people, Chinese Manchu people, who are working in communities that were claiming the status of a science as they were trying to develop a nationalist, kind of rationalized nationalist program for these communities. The Gobi was always an occasion to uncover deep history. So I'll read a couple paragraphs in a second that I hope kind of concisely states what I'm interested in here. But I'm very interested in the excavation of the Gobi, the tangle of the Gobi, as a kind of a set of possibilities for reimagining history, deep history in particular, because out of the Gobi came dinosaur bones, Neanderthal, skeletons of Neanderthal, Silk Road excavations, all kinds of, and also just like geologic stratification, that were all part of the profound kind of challenge to receive knowledge and imagination in certain knowledge communities around deep time, of just how long, and in the 19th and early 20th century, in fact, even among those setting out from New York on a steamship on behalf of the Central Asiatic expeditions and so on, the Gobi was called literally and regularly the Garden of Eden. For a time, it was considered to be the fertile kind of font of life itself, as this was being dramatically reimagined in the 19th and early 20th century. What's interesting also, and maybe I'll just flip through my slides here just because I'm already gabbing and I don't want to take too long. I'll come back to this in a sec. What is also happening in the 19th century in interesting ways and completely unstudied ways is a whole series of Gobi Renaissance movements, cultural movements, literary movements, aesthetic movements that were similarly engaging in new ways the materiality of the Gobi itself. One really colorful example I'll just share here, although there are many dozens I'm looking for and at already, is this figure Danzan Rabja, the Dokshin Soktuk Noyen, the great drunken lord of the Gobi. And he was this fierce, wild, tantric figure in the 19th century Gobi, with a chalice of alcohol in one hand. He was a monk, but in a tantric mode, and his quote unquote consorts, his harem around him. He was activating, in his language, these portals to Buddhist notions of Buddhist apocalyptical time, starting all these millenarian movements through portals to Shambhala and other kind of parallel worlds that draw on deep Indic kind of precedences in the Abhidharma Kalachakra Tantra, stuff that's too big to get into here, but literally a kind of an entire other mode of time making, of timing the present through engaging the material affordances of particular stretches of the Gobi. And some of the outcomes were Danzan Rabja was actually staging 150-person operas that were touring the Gobi with 100, all these actors and moving set pieces. And the Qing eventually murdered him because he was getting a bit too popular. But there's a whole amount, there's all these kind of like local traditions that are sort of operating alongside, sometimes in collaboration with, also often without any knowledge of, or as a kind of act of refusal to these incursions of scientific imperialism as well. And before I read just a couple paragraphs of the questions that are motivating this work at this point, I should say that this is also coming out of having spent nearly a year, all told, in the Gobi, in this community here in Dagran Chorachid in central Gobi, so about 200 kilometers south of Ulaanbaatar. going back almost terrifyingly, almost 20 years, when on my first trip, I found a dinosaur bone with this monk in the Flaming Cliffs, which is an area we were visiting with a bunch of monks. But in the early 1920s is where Roy Chapman Andrews and others sent their convoys on Ford cars and stole a lot of dinosaur bones that are in the Met in New York and are in London and are in France now, and which Mongolia would love to desperately to get back. But this was my first trip to Mongolia, and it was interesting to find a bone dinosaur, which we buried again so that no one would be able to come find and take away. But to think with people who are Gobi dwelling people, this Lama there, who's a very kind of rich, high Lama, you can tell maybe, is himself the abbot of a Gobi monastery, is from this Gobi community. And to think about how that long history of basically imperial extraction and the making of deep history in this sort of language of a science was kind of stood in balance with and critiqued by otherwise practices of unearthing, naming, dispossessing, absolutely, and extending, kind of rescaling the human in these deep models of time. So these are just some of the communities that I've spent some time in there. So if I have just 3 minutes, maybe I could just read a paragraph or two of the questions that are getting me up in the morning. The research I've been doing this 3 months is really too raw to get into, but I'll just maybe share what I'm stoked about right now, if that's okay. So, okay, the Gobi Desert is not a consensual idea. It has for ages been a contrarian stage of desire and repulsion, of mobility and obstruction. The Mongols who live there have called it the great, fearsome, desolate Gobi. It is, by many measures, an immense and inhospitable place existing on and as the margin of states and empires. The Gobi has also always been heartland, considered by those living in its folds to be of their blood and bones. And for untold centuries, untold communities of Turks, Mongols, Persians, Tibetans, Chinese, and others, many others, have made themselves and place and time there. And this is part of this vast desert system in the heartland of Asia, which surprisingly, there are no dedicated scholarly monographs dedicated to as yet. The Gobi is not a stage, but a fauna possibility for mobility, obstruction, connection, separation, interaction, and isolation. It's a space made at the intersection of the sea, the sky, and the land. The material Gobi has also been a membrane of past and present, and that's what I'm most interested in this project. Also a membrane of progress and stasis of the human and the inhuman, so much sand blowing and settling atop the longue durée of its vast ecology. A contemporary Gobi poet named Mendoyo writes of his homeland, quote, "This desert we speak of has brought forth over the course of time animals and humans and rocks all in their proper colors and forms," end quote. And indeed, the Gobi and its adjacent deserts have always been marginal in the way that I'm interested in this book. Here are permeable landscapes across which the present is hitched to its many pasts. The tantric yogi and the botanist, the lonely pilgrim and the paleontologist, the Buddhist monastic historian and those scraping away sand from the bones of Peking man. All make time by interacting with the geographic media of the desert, the material affordances of the desert, the constraints of the tangle that kind of exceed for me in interesting ways any kind of nature-culture divide, which is another kind of point of this book for me. Across the porous membrane of this materialized Gobi, human and natural history, all in their, quote, proper colors and forms, have been, as Michel de Salto would say, set apart in circulatory trans-Eurasian practices of unearthing and writing that exceed the usual topographies of culture, nature, human, inhuman, West and non-West. And so I should say that sort of most recently, I've been really interested in reading some of the work, for example, of Catherine Yusof and others who have been thinking about the excavatory logics of only apparently neutral scientific fields like geology, thinking about how extraction, naming, dispossession has always produced divisions of the human and inhuman, which were central to projects, for example, like the transatlantic slave trade, the colonial project of America or Canada or whatever, and remains actually central not just to the hard sciences, but possibly, allegedly also, the humanities and social sciences. I mean, we're all sort of beholden to a certain type of extractive logic that requires critique. And so I'm really interested in, implicating myself, my own excavatory practices in thinking about these 19th century excavations, and to wonder how I might not reproduce in my own work on the model of this more expanded frame of Gobi users might resist or refuse, or maybe just name the ways that my own disciplinary spaces and practices reproduce a human-inhuman division, and certainly a nature-culture divide, which are profoundly problematic, both sort of empirically, but also in terms of like their genocidal and implications and the erasures that they entail. So I'm kind of interested in that way of doing a sort of radical environmental history, but also social and intellectual history that it hopefully tries to exceed any of those categories and contribute something to the critical Asian humanities, thinking about kind of possibilities of mobility, connection, and so on and so forth, having to do with the Gobi. So that's the weird project I'm up to, and I'm very excited to be doing. It has a lot to do with the 19th century. I don't know if I talked too long, but
No, thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. That was really great. I think any talk that ends with, this is causing me to rethink everything that I'm doing, deeply is very productive. So, and it resonates very well with me too. So thank you so much, Matt. Okay, Kyle, are you ready? Or I could jump in, but you're welcome to go. You're ready. Excellent.
I need to unmute. Apologies for that. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations so far. I'm really looking forward to our dialogue. I have so many questions that you all raised. So I don't have a title. I thought about this for a bit, and I'm struggling with a title for my current book project. It's not anywhere near finalized, but it's essentially on antiquity and its reception in the Maghreb in the longue durée through the 21st century. But of that, the long global 19th century plays a massive, oftentimes outsized role. And so as part of this, I have a couple, well, before I do the big questions, I also want to acknowledge that I am sitting in Riverside with a view of Box Spring Mountain from where I live. So especially the land of the Cahuilla peoples, but also, as Robyn noted, Tongva, Serrano, Luiseño as well. And thinking of my own history, living so many places in the United States, I feel like there are many more acknowledgements that I need to go back and look at, since I've been so many places here and benefited from so many institutions. So big questions that I'm asking, I guess there are two. The first is, to what extent is the Maghreb, thinking broadly of North Africa, north of the Sahel, north of the Sahara, but including parts of the northern Sahara, are longue durée colonized? I mean, we think of the 19th century, especially when we think of French Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia and the Maghreb, but given that we've had in these regions colonizations happening since the Punic Phoenician, the Greeks, for example, in Cyrene, Libya, and other places, the Roman conquests, whether those being the Punic Wars against Carthage, but also the Numidian Wars against Jugurtha, the arrival of the Vandals in late antiquity, the wars of the Greeks, the Byzantine Greeks in the area, the Arab invasions, and going all the way through the French, Americans, British, Italian, Spanish in the modern world. And so this space that's been continually colonized, and I'm not sure, I don't yet have an answer to the significance of that And because I don't want to overprivilege the Maghreb, I know it's sort of the space I'm working on, and I don't want to say, oh, this has only happened here, because that's probably not true. But the other big question that I have is, to what extent is modern colonialism, if we think about the Maghreb, a modern phenomenon? And that is, the more sources I look at from the French, British, and American accounts of Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, the more I find antiquity as a sort of central motivator. That is, the French really seem to think that they were reliving the Roman conquests in the region, and it seems like their entire ideological apparatus of conquest was framed around looking for traces of Roman presences in order to justify their particular colonization. So, and I apologize if I keep using that word. I'm repeating myself a bit. So one theme that seems to come up a lot, and it will likely be a chapter, has to do with gender and the question of the body, the Maghreb as a kind of feminine space, feminine body. So here is the General Thomas Robert Bugeaud, who's famously known as the conqueror of Algeria. He led many of the campaigns, most of them, up into just before the submission of Abdelkader, who Bugeaud was no longer in power at that point, but he was largely responsible and is thought of as the conqueror of Algeria. And he wrote a massive 3-volume history of Algeria, Histoire de l'Algérie française. So it's got French Algeria is what he's calling it in his book title. But the first 100 or so pages consist of an account of antiquity. And within that account, he talks about the iconographic representation of Africa in antiquity as a woman. He says the ancient peoples represented Africa under the emblem of a woman crowned with grain, in the shadow of palm tree fronds, and carrying in her hand a cornucopia of abundance girded with grapes. Today, seeing this land almost entirely fallow, so there's this whole question, right, of the French atrocities and disasters when it came to starvation. And this is already something that's emerging, the sort of misuse of land in the 19th century authors, even though it becomes much more prevalent in the early 20th century, for example, with Albert Camus and his Algerian Chronicles. So it's already beginning in the global 19th century, with British and French authors noting this dilemma. Today, seeing this land almost entirely fallow, one might think that the emblem of fertility under which she, so Africa, was represented, was nothing but a hyperbolic exaggeration. Yet it is nothing of the sort. On the contrary, this powerful nature is characterized by a spontaneity of production that astounds, and we understand how Africa could once have been the granary of Rome. And so we see this motif coming up in a number of authors from the period, but also, since, and I know there are some art historians here today, I wanted to also jump into the iconographic representations from the period that seem to play on this motif. So in the bottom right, you have a coin from the reign of Hadrian, and on its reverse, so this is an aureus coin, you have Africa represented lying sort of supine, in this case holding a scorpion with a traditional elephant skin headdress, and then there is a cornucopia basket at her feet. We see this same kind of iconography in 19th century etching, painting, and postcard photography. And frequently we see bare-breasted women. And what's striking, and I didn't include this quote, was a number of authors talk about this in their writings from the 19th century. So Gustave Flaubert in Salammbô, which I know Heidi is familiar with, I know others probably might be too, but this sort of historical fiction about this figure of Salammbô, who is entirely invented. We have no historical record for her in the Greco-Roman writings, somehow linked to the fall and sack of Carthage. Throughout that novel, there's this emphasis on her body, whether the sort of nude scene where she is with the snake, but also in the tent during her sort of mission. And we see this sort of obsession with the woman's breast as a kind of fertility motif. We also see it in the writings of the Baron Bachou de Penhoen, who was involved in leading an expedition in Algeria. And he cites Strabo and Pliny to talk about how the land can be equated with a breast. So there is this kind of use of women's bodies going back to and using ancient sources to justify it in search for a kind of fertility, a kind of, perhaps we can see a sort of feminization of the Maghreb on purpose to suggest a receptivity to colonization and to conquest with all of the gendered motifs that go with that. Of course, strikingly, the Maghreb also becomes a space where women use their own bodies as bomb carriers as a mode of resistance. Later in the 20th century, I don't know if I can talk of the long global 19th century as extending into the 20th century, but I feel like these questions persist, and bodies, given that they become part of the corpora, of the written corpora of the region. I'm struck that also during this period and after, you start to see writers looking back to the 19th and also antiquity. Essential as a mode of bridging these various periods of exploitation and resistance, whether they're the bodies of the Sétif and Gelma peoples during those particular massacres in the 20th century, whether it's the 19th century with Pélissier and Saint-Arnaud, basically asphyxiating the Ouled Ria and other Kabyle tribes as part of their conquests. We see sort of this question of bodies and bodies of women, and I think we can see it extending to the 1990s with the Algerian Civil War, the later Algerian Civil War, in which the bodies of writers, some of whom were, for example, Abdelkader Alula, who was assassinated, the playwright, was the brother-in-law of Azia Djebar. So there is this question of what happens, how do bodies represent forms of knowledge in the region in the longue durée. The other question that really has been on my mind, and I guess I've already mentioned it to you all, I'll try to be quick since I know I'm taking too much time, and that is this idea of reliving history, reliving the Roman conquests. And I just want to end with a couple quotes here. I mentioned Saint-Arnaud. He's one of the genociders in chief during this time. He is critiqued by Djebar for his massacres that, unlike Pélissier, for example, another figure who is notorious for his massacres, did not recognize the bodies. And so Djebar, in her novel L'amour, la fantasia, gives praise to not Saint-Arnaud, but his contemporary Pélissier, because he actually made an effort to recover and document the bodies, whereas for Saint-Arnaud, these were not of interest. He just left them after his various massacres. But notably, he is looking to antiquity to justify his ideologies, and I apologize, I'm trying to minimize so I can see my text. Okay, he writes in one of the letters to his brother, among no other people, I believe, are there as many contrasts as among the Arabs, and there is no people that is less advanced, less changed than that group. Every day I see the days of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. I see the Numidians of Juba and of Massinissa. I saw near Constantine the war bands of Jugurtha. The men are the same, the horses are the same, the dress is entirely the same. What have time and civilization brought them? So there's this potential question involving, through many of the ethnographic writings, but also letters like those of Saint-Arnaud, this notion that somehow this region hasn't changed since antiquity, and that makes it somehow reasonable to conquer, or somehow it's going to be easier to conquer these peoples if we can somehow view them as sort of unorganized nomadic tribes, as opposed to places of great civilization. So there is that colonial mentality really seeping through here. In another letter, he thinks of himself as being surrounded by the spirits of a number of famous figures from antiquity. So he and his men, he describes that they're sitting around the camp and there's a fire roaring with pleasantries. And he says that it must have thoroughly amused Scipio, Jugurtha, Sulla, Massinissa, and Juba. So all these leading figures from antiquity, if their souls perchance roamed around us. So he really sees himself as not just an heir to, but I guess someone living alongside these figures from antiquity as part of his conquests. And I'll end with one last quote. This is from Camille Rousset, who wrote a preface to Sallust's war of Jugurtha, war against Jugurtha. And he describes this particular theater of Algeria as being particularly significant for the French reader, for it is the soil of our own Algeria, the Roman past, laid that grand foundation in which we rediscover with admiration the vestiges of ages past. We must honor our earliest predecessors in Africa as instructors and models. And it's worth noting, just in conclusion, that this particular text by Rousset was published by the Bibliothèque de l'Armée Française, so the Library of the French Army. And so there is very much a kind of military indoctrination happening as well, trying to somehow get French soldiers to believe through reading these texts that they are in fact the heirs of the Romans, and through their conquest, they're sort of repeating the sort of long Imperium Romanum Roman history. So I really just touched on a couple things, but I'm looking forward to people's responses and questions. And I should note for those working on the Americas that there are a number of figures from American history who were involved as well from the early 19th century, given the interests, economic interests in the Barbary Wars, and trying to resolve those. And as a result, they were stationed in Algeria as well during this period. It includes figures who were stationed there that were slave owners in the South, in Savannah, and were studying sub-Saharan languages as part of their own sort of colonial histories. So thank you all for your time today.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle. I know your project a bit, and it's always such a pleasure to learn more and more about it. Thank you so much. So we have a bit more time. I do have a little presentation of my own on the 19th century, as I am a global 19th century person. So I'm going to just very quickly go through mine, which is, I thought I would just start by talking a tiny bit about, where I've come from and what I'm sort of ongoing work too. So I'm a scholar of, I guess, 19th century French literature is my training, but I work a lot in visual culture and material culture as well. And so for a long time, I've been working sort of on fashion, in part because this was part of my, my dissertation turned into my first book, which is called Fashioning Spaces, Mode and Modernity in Late 19th Century Paris. And that's there on the left. And then the subject of fashion is so rich, and I just found it sort of ongoing after that project. A lot of the things that I've published since then is kind of takes fashion not as material culture, although that's of interest to me, but I am not a costume historian. I really kind of usually tell people I don't know anything about fashion and garments, or just very little, but I'm looking at fashion as a metaphor and really kind of as a lens, as a way for me to talk about the things that I'm really interested in. So for a while there, these included always the body, and gender, issues of gender, architecture, urban space, exile, questions about modernity in the late 19th century that were being figured through fashion by a lot of writers at the period who were very anxious about what they were seeing around them as life and society changed, and they often focused their anxiety through fashion. So that's kind of how I got started in the first place, was sort of parsing that out. I study literary texts, so novels, short stories, poetry, film, painting. Lately, I've been getting very interested in photography and doing quite a bit of work in photography, so early photography, mid-19th century. Photography, just post-daguerreotypes, so the period when photography was just coming into being as a new medium. And I do work a little bit on material objects and textiles, and so that is all sort of interest. The time period that I usually work on is sort of the 19th century, but up through the present, I've worked on 20th century topics as well. So just to cite a few recent publications, I got very interested in intersections between France and Thailand in the 19th century. That actually started in the 17th century, and the ways in which the French were sort of engaging with Thailand, and really, really interested in the Thai royalty and what they were wearing throughout these different periods. And so I focused mostly on 19th century encounters as they were depicted in the press, and all the way up until the 1960s. And the sort of the current royal family in Thailand, and when they first, the Queen of Thailand, Queen Sirikit, and her husband, Bhumibol, went to France in the 1960s and kind of made this big sort of show of Thailand's modernity in the West, and how this was covered in the French press. So that was one thing that I worked on in the last sort of recently. I've also been really interested in thinking about clothing and dress as commodities, but also their relation, not just the clothing themselves, but what clothing means. And I got very interested in thinking about how revolution and insurrectionary past moments in history are sort of commodified, like they're turned into items to be bought and sold today by different groups for different reasons, right? And so I was looking at a contemporary fashion company that is named for the 1871 commune uprising that occurred in Paris. And so this contemporary menswear brand has taken that up and they've sort of branded it, and they sell really expensive cups and garments and things that completely go against the revolutionary ideals that were being fought for during the commune uprising itself. And I sort of set this against what was happening at the time. So this was a few years ago, but you may remember the Yellow Vest protests in France, and how those contrasted to what this company was doing. And then my most recent publication in terms of fashion is of an article that I wrote about Christine Duverger, who is my colleague. She teaches French at UCR, and she's also a novelist. And so Christine Duverger is from Mauritius, which is an island nation off the coast of Africa, between Africa and the Indian Ocean. So that's where she comes from, and she writes about sort of transnationalism, sort of experiences, drawing on her own experiences, although she doesn't write autobiography, but it's on sort of intersections and experience between living and growing up in Mauritius and coming to America. And in this last novel, which is called Les Vies de Lorena, Duverger really focuses on the abusive labor practices of American sort of George Bush era and Trump era overseas apparel industries that go into different parts of the world, including Mauritius, and have these very damaging effects on the local populations. And so she explores this through fiction, through her narratives. So that's kind of where I was, and I still am, because I still kind of find myself being constantly, sort of invited to continue work on fashion in some way. So that's been really great. But the main book project that I've been working on takes less from the fashion side of things and more from the spatial side of things. So I've gotten very interested in architecture, and I'm finishing a monograph called this is the working title. It's called Beyond Building, Architecture and Gender in 19th Century France. And this book grew out of my sort of frustration with my own work, which was not, to my mind, centering women's voices enough as much as I wanted it to. And so I was learning more about architecture and space in France in the 19th century. And it came to me that, I started looking for sort of, well, who were the women architects in France in the 19th century? And it turns out there aren't any. There weren't any. And this is because women were not allowed to train. They weren't allowed to enter into architecture school or into higher education at all until the end of the 19th century. And so this got me very interested in the question of, well, what is architecture and where were the women? And so I sort of began from the premise that there were women architects and that it would be my job to figure out sort of who they were. And so this project has been a project of almost creating my own archive because the different chapters each treat a different woman or in one case it's a gender fluid person, so woman might not be the right word, but anyway, so each chapter is about a different person who was working in some different kind of creative area, but people from the outside probably wouldn't look at them and say these are architects or what they're doing is architecture. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to say, yes, well, things like poetry is architectural, photography is, archaeology is, fiction. I've been kind of moving away from fiction a little bit just because I don't want to talk about books that talk about architecture. So I'm moving a little bit away from my literary base. But anyway, and so the images that I'm showing you here are just a few of the chapters that I talk about. So I have a photographer there on the far right who was working in the 1850s and photographing Brittany, so out on the far west coast of France and photographing architecture. She's basically the first architectural photographer. I'm arguing, and nobody knows anything about her, very little. The middle image is of a frieze that was stolen by a couple called the Dulafroy, and so I'm interested in Jane Dulafroy, who is a gender fluid person who went with their husband to Persia, to Iran, and excavated the ancient city of Suez and brought back all of these archaeological finds and rebuilt them, basically. So that's the architectural side of it, in the Louvre. So if you go to the Louvre Museum today in Paris, you will see that frieze. And then the left-hand corner, I have just a picture of the architectural academies, which were all male. And so that's sort of the men's club, and this is what my book is pushing back against. And so because we have not very much time, I'm just going to very quickly go to another project that I'm concurrently working on. And so this is not a book project, but it's a research article project and a symposium and hopefully an exhibit eventually. And so this one is called Representing Indigeneity, Women and Work. And it is an examination of a cache of photographs that I came across a few years ago when I was in Scotland. I was a Fulbright visiting professor at the University of Aberdeen, and they have this amazing photography collection. And I learned about this, this grouping of glass plate images that were taken of Hawaii. And so I got very interested in studying these, but what I'm trying to do, and what I knew that I didn't want to do, is use sort of Western epistemologies to understand these images. And so I've been working with colleagues and also just learning a lot more of Indigenous feminist scholarship, which is helping me approach these photographs. So I will stop there because we have just a few more minutes here, although we have the room, so to speak. And I'd like to just invite people to unmute and to ask questions. Obviously, the speakers should feel free to ask questions of one another. And if you prefer, you can write it into the chat. Sometimes that's easier for people, depending on your internet connection. So if anyone has a question, please jump in. Okay. Thanks, Fatima.
Hi, Fatima. Sorry to see you go. I just have a comments or comments, maybe a question as well, but this has been interesting, and it's interesting that certain themes, topics come up across all these different works. And so that's been interesting for me to observe. But certainly for Mary and Robyn working in sort of California, I'm always interested in the way that kind of Native history and this time period is parallel in a way to experiences in Africa. I mean, in my particular region, we don't have settler colonialism, but obviously the sort of colonial expansion piece is the same. I was interested in this idea of these conceptions of time and how we deal with time. There's so much more to be said. I feel like we have no time and we're not going to get to all of this, but the idea of multiple layers of time and different notions of time. And so Mary, what you were talking about in terms of feasting, I was really thinking about your dates and time, because one of the things that we're all dealing with, especially for those who are working outside Europe, is this idea of European sources, European archives, European conceptions of everything. And then the places and the people we're talking about have multiple conceptions of many of the, main categories. And so I think there's a lot to be said in terms of, scholars and thinking about how to deal with that as opposed to sort of papering it over. And I think, Matt, you were bringing up some of this in terms of, reflexivity and kind of not kind of repeating that. And so anyway, I'll shut up, but I am interested that there's commonality across our various sort of geographical research areas in terms of the problems. And so I'd be interested in thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone doesn't have a comment, I would like to say, Jody, thank you so much for that. And I was really struck by thinking about how archives come up in a lot of these projects, right? And kind of wrestling with the archive itself as an institution. Matt, I know this is something that you are tackling head on too, right, with your various groups, and I think a number of us are too. So I was interested in thinking about, the production of knowledge, Jody, that you were talking about, and specifically about, different ways to think about where knowledge exists, where it resides. And then I guess the question is, how do you access that? So I was really interested in this idea of indigo being, a place of knowledge that you can, that we can learn something from. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more just about that, like about your process of, I don't want to say the word extracting. I keep, that's a terrible word, but like accessing or learning, I guess, from indigo. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, I think we all have a fundamental problem. I mean, Matt, you mentioned it in terms of, this is not only the sources and the structure, but the methods and the breadth. So much of our work is this extraction, and it is an unresolved issue, right? And so there's that. But just 2 words on that, and I should shut up so people can talk, is this idea of indigo, as it turns out, is sort of ethnically specific when you start thinking about sort of groups that have been dominant over a long period of time, which goes into language and culture and politics, but also gender, because many of the dyers are, traditionally, historically, women within these particular groups. And so just thinking about that, already we have a whole range, a whole network of information and a whole way of thinking about the past in that region. So that really is kind of like the first step, is right, imagining who is the network, what's the universe of knowers that we're trying to talk about. And then I think the steps, and then the idea of processing a green plant into a dye. I mean, there's all kinds of work around that, but it's, there's knowledge involved, and in terms of how to cultivate it, when to pick it, and the fermentation and all of that, which is kind of almost, it's very detailed, specialized knowledge. And so you were talking about using archives, but also thinking about ethnography, thinking about oral tradition, thinking about field work. So that would be a short and abbreviated
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting that the first work is to start thinking about it, right? Imagining what is this network that I'm interested in trying to approach, and hopefully, in new ways. Yeah, thank you so much. Are there other comments or questions that arose?
I unfortunately am going to have to go in a moment just for my daughter at school. I'm sorry I can't stay a little longer, but I wanted to say also just it was really interesting, as Jody said, to see all these sort of resonances across these projects. And in addition to those that he listed and that you listed, Heidi, I thought also of sort of like materializing knowledge. Materiality seemed to be really a big part of our all of these projects. And that seems like a really interesting site actually to plumb, not just thinking about I mean, I feel like there are sort of theoretical implications there, not just a sort of wider breadth of traces and sources that might reveal historical sources. And particularly, I'm thinking about that in terms of landscape. And one thing I just wanted to mention, though, for Robyn, before I have to go, was a work of someone who I know, Pamela Klassen, who's done some really interesting work on the extension of the frontiers of the Canadian Christian nationalist colonial project out west in Port Coquitlam in northern British, what's now so-called northern British Columbia, looking at the language of natural resources vis-a-vis Indigenous models of kinship and obligation through land. And she has a book that has looked at this in a micro-historical way, and she's currently at Harvard leading a bunch of working groups thinking about natural resources as not just a discourse, of course, but an infrastructure of colonialism. And I mean, I'm from Canada and was involved with Indigenous studies when I was up there. And of course, natural resources is everywhere. It remains everywhere in Canada, rights to land and all that. And I think that that's really up there, at least, that's a context in which discourses of wilderness were also being invented and deployed. It was all part of the same project. So I just wanted to recommend her work, both the book that she has out and the working groups she's part of at Harvard right now. I think would be really useful, maybe for you, the project's already really interesting, but it might be nice to think a little bit about her work. And then, yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Robyn. Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, didn't actually mention her name.
I'm sorry. Sorry, it's Pamela Klassen. I'll write it in the.
Okay, thank you. Yes, because that's definitely all part of the wilderness, is like determining what is cultivatable or what is profitable versus what is not.
The book is Radio Mind, where she looks at these crazy not crazy, but really complex intersections of Native relations with land, Christian nationalism, colonialism, and natural resources. Anyways, it's there.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you.